Welcome to this session. My name is Asbjörn Ejsing, and with me I also have Daniel Akenine, and we'll be talking a little bit about what we from Microsoft do with regards to two things. One is my topic, which is the topic of the Azure region in Sweden, or rather I should say geography in Sweden. And the second one is, of course, the data sovereignty and Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty, which is another piece of this puzzle that we're building in Sweden as well. So my name is Asbjörn Ejsing, as I said. I'm the data center lead for the Microsoft Data Center Azure region. It also incorporates all of our SaaS capabilities, so the M365, the D365 deployments, Power Apps, etc. All of that, all of things that land in Sweden for some reason or other, I have some kind of conversation with. And I also am responsible locally for implementing or executing service availability pipeline, which is another portion of what I do on a daily basis. And that's why I'm talking to you today. And this is just what I've done in the past. But let's move on to the topic at hand. So I think one of the things that that is super crucial, and I mentioned it in my opening statement, is we are really building a geography, and by building a geography in Azure, that kind of also comes with all of the other type of capabilities that we as Microsoft provide. So the services stack in terms of the way that we build our network capabilities is part of that basic infrastructure. The Azure foundational services is then what we build all of our M365 capabilities on top of, or our D365 capabilities, all of which will be present in Sweden once we are complete with our build out. And even though we opened this data center region roughly a year ago in November of 2021, we've been building, and we continue to build. And I'll talk a little bit about what that actually means in terms of availability, not only of services, but also in terms of pure raw capacity. Of course, when we talk about the full technology stack, all of the things that then build on top of that is, of course, of importance as well, and all of the specific industry flavors of what we do is, of course, then being represented through the services that we are providing. And one of the things that is not on this slide is, of course, the topic at hand with Daniel's presentation, which is the Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty, which again has to do with the way that we operate and think about making sure that data stays where you intended it to stay and is processed the way you intended it to be processed. Because we are in a foundational provider of services, so the data is yours. We're pretty proud of this stuff. We launched over 1,000 new capabilities or service capabilities in the last year alone. And just the other night, I read about, or we read about in the papers, that we're now integrating the ChatGPT or OpenAI capabilities into our search capabilities, which I think is going to be a fantastically interesting new step in the right direction of not only searching, but actually finding what you're looking for. So that's pretty exciting, and actually it kind of is exciting in terms of what we then do inside of the European Union or inside of the EU boundary, as we call it. Anyway, one of the things that I think is pretty cool with the way that we show our presence globally is, of course, not the dots themselves, on this world map of Azure availability, but actually the lines that connects them. And that is our global WAN, it's our express route capabilities, is the way that we interconnect. We are the second largest provider of those services in the world. And of course, that means that the region that we're now going to talk about is part of that global network. It's part of that global hyperscale cloud. But one thing that I'm particularly proud about, since I am representing the Sweden region, is of course the lilac. Is that the color? No. So you see it's a small satellite dish, and there's one in Sweden as well. That means that Sweden is the place where we can deliver our Azure orbital capabilities as well. And why is that important? Well, it's important because then you can get interconnectivity through multimedial environments. So that means from physical hardware lines or cabling all the way up to satellite communications into our region, which is pretty cool, I think. The other thing I want to point out on this particular map is, of course, the blue dots. Those are the ones where you peer into our network. So the peering point for Sweden is, of course, in Stockholm, but there is one in Finland, there is one in Norway, there's one in Denmark, etc., etc., etc. And getting to our network is, of course, super important to be able to utilize all of the cool stuff that we build. So one of the things that the intent of why we build things locally as well is because we want to make sure that you as customers, you as developers, can know where that data resides. So data residency for us is quite crucial. And data residency starts with where is the hardware, right? And in that hardware, you can then have your data reside or connect to that data. So data residency, where that is a legal requirement, is of course something of importance to us. So when I talked about the Azure region in Sweden, I talked about it as a geography. And why do I make that distinction? I make that distinction because in Sweden, we've actually built two regions. One you can see, it's publicly available. You can access it. You can execute your environments there. That region is called Sweden Central. It's in Gävle-Sandviken. There are 3 physical locations there. But we also have a secondary region in the Kingdom of Sweden, which is the Staffanstorp region, that acts as the geography pair to that primary region. And that then gets us into some really cool things that we can do and still have the data reside in Sweden. But, and this is a big important but, is of course that we are responsible for and we are providing the operations and the reliability of the cloud, of our hyperscale infrastructure, of the way that we execute the resilience of that in terms of power supply, in terms of duplication of data across multiple geographies or multiple regions, or the availability zones with all of the fun stuff that we can do by being zonally aware, such as the ZRS, for instance. But we are responsible here. It is crucial that you also understand your responsibility in the way that we execute, in the way that you look at infrastructure as code, in the way that you look at the execution environments to which you operate the applications. That responsibility lies with all of you, all of us in the industry, but particularly with our customers. Making sure that you understand the policies that then execute that environment. And that is crucial. The responsibility we're taking on is on the foundational level. We do a lot of stuff with regards to security. We do a lot of stuff with regards to physical capability and resilience and robustness of that infrastructure. But there is a portion of this that you are also responsible for. For instance, turning on simple things like MFA is important, because that protects you against 75% of all the cyber attacks that you can encounter as an organization, right? Simple stuff, but it's your responsibility. We provide it, but you have to turn it on and use it as an organization. So, having said that, we're pretty excited about the rate of the way that we build stuff. But I want to dig into what we've done in Sweden specifically. So in Sweden specifically, as I said, there are two regions, right? Sweden Central, that's the one you can see, that's the one you can pick. And then the Sweden South is a smaller auxiliary region to that central region. In the central region, we've actually built 3 availability zones. Now, availability zones can be built in a multitude of different ways. In Sweden, we've built it with 3 physical locations, separated from each other, but still very close, so you get very low latency profiles between the different availability zones. That means that you can get synchronous replication across those. You can utilize that to build a very resilient implementation with 3 separated sites, utilizing all of those things that we do as a foundation. And of course, each zone is completely independent with regards to cooling, power, networking infrastructure, etc. Right? So this is important, and it is important because the region, one region is of course then paired to the secondary region, and we utilize that for some of our services, but certainly also for services where that is required. And what's an example of that then? Well, if there is a need for you to separate your data with more than 250 kilometers, then you can utilize the secondary region. Why is that important? Well, earthquakes, floods, whatever, then that need arises. Not very usual in Sweden maybe, but certainly something that we think about when we think about how do we build the most robust environment for you to execute your applications and the customer needs and business requirements. I thought I'll dip into a bit of what we then do from the perspective of maintaining this robustness. Well, of course, you know this path, right? You know the path from a single VM that we're then, what do we do to improve the availability and the SLA configuration of that particular instance, all the way up to making sure that we manage clearly the disk and disk arrays that we have, or the racks that we implement, right? So that gets you from a 99.9 SLA all the way up to a 99.95 SLA, right? But this is what we're building, right? So in Sweden, this is what we built. We built a availability zone that utilizes all of this stuff, all of the other steps in this chain. What we built it the way that we then can provide very robust operations. Very robust operations. And of course, across all of that, the data is where the fundamentals go, right? So all of the Azure backup capabilities that then provides protection against accidental data loss, data corruption, which is equally poor for the operations of any application, and of course This piece here, rogue administration, that's where, again, this comes in about utilizing our policies and the way that we implement security, all the way down to the way that we implement the separation of duties in the services themselves. So in Sweden, we are building, we built this, right? But the people that work in the data center have absolutely no idea what data is stored on what machine or in what disk array, right? Which means that when they get a replacement request, the only thing they get is a barcode. They go in, they replace the specific hard drive. Since the hard drive has passed through the gates and into our environment, that hard drive must be destroyed upon end of life. So we actually mill it down or turn it into to dust at site, which means that if you are fortunate enough to ever visit one of the data centers, please don't bring a USB drive because we will destroy it on site, right? So it is important that we do that from a security perspective, but it's actually also important that we do that from an environmental perspective. So the Microsoft Circular Center, which is part of the way that we operate these data centers, is actually a way for us to also maintain or reduce the electronic waste that we produce as part of our operations. So making sure that we take care of all of that, all of those precious metals and the precious services that, or the hardware that we provide, is also part of the way that we operate our data center, because it's actually this is one of the most advanced data centers that we know how to build, also from a sustainability and environmental perspective, which is pretty cool. Anyway, so this is it. This is a picture from roughly a year, a little bit more than a year ago. I think it was October of 21 maybe. But I wanted to point out a couple of things with regards to what we are building. So this is one of the 3 sites in Gävle-Sandviken, and these buildings here are where the data center resides. So these are Ballard design constructions. They are so people, right? People, data center. Okay, we operate them in blocks. So that means that each and every one of these sections is actually a colo block. And that colo block then has separation of power, separation of network connectivity, etc. So each of these blocks then builds up a massive amount of blocks with individual power supply to that individual block. So we can have failures on regions, we can have failures on a specific block, but not necessarily on the entire building, etc. Right? The other thing that I think is pretty awesome is that we're taking it straight from the high power grid. So it's in Sweden it's called ställverk, which we actually have connected directly to the core power grid, providing the energy for this. And as you can see in this picture, we've built. So this is the what we opened with, and this is the section that we opened with, so that we can provide the services. What we do now is that we're building another one of these, and another one of these, and another one of these, and another one of these on the same physical location. Depending on customer demand, of course, depending on you wanting to use our services here in Sweden, which I'm pretty sure that you would want to do because of a couple of reasons. First, it's pretty close to our customers, so latency is pretty neat. It's It's market competitive with regards to pricing, so we're pretty proud of that. It's the most sustainable data center region that we know how to build, and we're operating it with 100% renewable energy. And we also have the ambition for Sweden Central to become a sister region to Amsterdam and Ireland, which means that we will have a very full set of services in the Sweden region. And by very full set of services, if you're familiar with the way that we divide our services, it's foundational services, it's mainstream services, and it's strategic services. All of the foundational services are already there. They were there from day one. All of the mainstream services, except one, is there, and a whole slew of data services in the strategic category, such as the MV2s, the ANF, the Databricks of the world. All of those services are also already available in the region, which means that we are very capable of delivering any and all workloads that you would like to have. And if you don't find the service that you would like to deploy in this particular region, Sweden, do please contact me, because I do want to know if there is something that you feel is missing. And as I said, we are still building. And we will continue to build for very, very many years to come. I see that there's somebody that's raising their hands. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. Is that okay? So this is pretty cool. And then, of course, all of the security frameworks that we have around, the gates, as I said, once you pass this, or actually here, I think it is, once the hardware passes this, it doesn't leave in a whole form. If you have any data-bearing devices on you. And of course, we are very, very proud of the way that we handle security. This is on the logical level that I'm talking about here, and this is, of course, one of the things that I feel is super important to point out. 43 trillion threat signals that we analyze globally daily to protect our services and our customers' services. 43 trillion threat signals. We are investing heavily in the security area, and we will continue to invest heavily in the security area because it is super important, of course. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention another perspective. We talk a lot about, and Daniel will talk a lot about robustness and security in terms of data residency, but you could also look at it from a different perspective and say, I don't necessarily want my data to be only present in country because conflict. I want my data to be distributed in a global environment, such as the way that we have done it for the Ukraine government when they were attacked. And in this report, and in the consequence reports after that, I think there were a couple of key points that we're making. I'm going to jump this and then go. So, in summary, data residency, very cool. Security and compliance, we are investing heavily and continue to defend your data. It's close. And therefore the latency profile is super beneficial, and of course it's the most sustainable that we have. And with this, I would like to hand over to Daniel.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Asbjörn. So I'm going to spend the second part of this session then to talk a little bit about three things. So sovereignty, what does that mean? How do we think about that? Some of the legal challenges that we hear about when it comes to cloud in general, and also new perspective. How do you work with cloud in a total defense perspective? Because that's kind of a new question that has risen. So my name is Daniel Akenine. I work as something called National Technology Officer for Microsoft. So I'm responsible then for Microsoft technology policy and strategy, so to say, in Sweden. And I also do a lot of other work outside Microsoft. So I work a lot with the government. I'm part of the Digitaliseringsrådet, which is part of the Minister of Digitalization's advisory board. I also work a lot of legal stuff. So I've been part of some of the legal investigations on how can you adopt Swedish law to digitalization so it's not unnecessary problems with law and digitalization. So I focus on security, policy, strategy, and new technology, so to say, and the mix of that. So, so the agenda here is basically three things, and I will start with total defense. So I think from this slide is actually a quite old slide I did for many years ago. I just brought it back because it never changes to some extent. It is architectural kind of perspective on how do you keep resources and data. Are you using a decentralized strategy or are you having a centralized strategy? And just going back 50, 60 years, you have seen this pendulum go from very centralized IT, you know, have the mainframes, you actually had to go physically to the mainframe to do something. And then suddenly you had the possibility of accessing it through terminals. Then you had the client-server era coming back with a lot of power on the PC, and the data came back to the PC. And then you had internet, it switched it again to... So you're constantly seeing that. You're seeing that as well. So cloud is some kind of centralized IT, but you also have edge computing, which is kind of pushing it back to the edge again. So this is something that's always shifting. And it has some consequences when it comes to things like incidents and also total defense. So, because in general, this is to some extent a naive picture, but you could say you have two choices here. So you could have a very decentralized system, which basically means that things is going to happen all the time. There is some incident. So if you have 1,000 systems, 2, 3, 4 of them is going to have an incident constantly. But the consequences are quite low because it's part of a bigger system. Or if you have a very centralized system, there will probably be much fewer incidents because it's simpler to actually monitor those systems. But if there is a consequence, that's obviously is going to be much higher. So what would you choose in this situation? And can you address some of those as well? Because you could also think about, you don't necessarily have to choose, can you actually address them? So you could say, well, I want a centralized system, but I don't want any incidents at all. That's probably the best strategy. But you know, it's not possible. You can never think about a strategy where you will say, I will have zero incidents, because that's not reality. But you can, of course, address that, and that's what's happening. That has been happening for a long time now. Things happen, you learn, you adopt, and the consequences gets smaller. You could, of course, also lower the consequences. And here I think we have a lot of possibilities. And I think from the perspective that also Asbjörn was talking about is that you can obviously use cloud to increase resilience. And I think that's a shared responsibility. So it's Microsoft and the cloud providers' responsibility to see that these services are up, but also that they have the capabilities for you to develop things or applications that are more resilient. So you have the possibility of having a lot of data centers, you have all these regions, you have all these availability sets, etc. And it's possible to design an application to be more resilient as well. So I have been thinking a little bit on this topic from more of a national perspective, and I got an op-ed published in Dagens Nyheter a couple of months ago, together with two other co-writers, where we were thinking about how do we think about kind of the future going forward in a larger perspective, especially when we see what's happening in Ukraine and the surrounding areas, and also because we are getting so more dependent on this technology, that the consequences are going to be a little bit more challenging. So are we ready to put everything into the cloud, and are you ready to understand the consequences of that? So I'm not going to go super deep here, but I think the three main proposals that we made to the government in this op-ed was basically number one, there is not really a good discussion on cloud versus basically versus risk and incidents on a national level today. There is no strategy. So it's focused on certain topics, certain questions, but there is no method to actually understand what are the benefits and what are the challenges with cloud from that perspective. So one of the things that we are pushing for is to create such a strategy. And then the other topic is trying to understand which part of our new digital infrastructure are actually important. So normally, if you want to classify systems, you classify them on data. But maybe that's not the most important thing. Maybe it's actually more important to understand how dependent are all the other systems from this system, this typical system. So there is a need also to classify system, not necessarily based on data, but based on functionality as well. And number three is basically creating a plan B. So, a lot of organizations has a continuous plan, and there is plan B, but not from a national perspective. And there is so much you can do. To be honest, even if you have a system that's like, $1 million system, you could probably do 25% of that in an Excel sheet as well. But do you have that Excel sheet? Are you ready to use that Excel sheet? No, not necessarily. So there is so much plan B that is not being done today. So there's a lot of work to do there as well. But this is some of the new questions that I think we haven't been discussing so much, and there's a lot of things that needs to be done in that area. Number two, cloud and legal environment. We have had a lot of discussions on cloud. We have Schrems 2 the summer of 2020, but there's also a lot of other legal discussions on what happens when you put data in the cloud. So I just wanted to update you a little bit of some of the projects that we are working on. And some of those initiatives are not necessarily related to a specific legal problem, but they have a legal effect. Because if you can protect data, for instance, from certain, from Microsoft, for instance, it gets a legal effect. So I'm just going to bring up a couple of them. So number one is one important initiative called EU Data Boundary, which is something that we promised 1.5 years ago, so a little bit more. What is that? EU Data Boundary is a promise that data that contains personal data will not leave the European Union. So isn't that the case already? Yeah, to some extent it is, but you also have data that could be in logs or in support cases or in other ways doing a transfer. And transfers outside the EU is challenging because you have the Schrems 2 verdict. You need to protect that data, which makes it more complex then. So this was launched January 2023, so it's here finally. And that means from January 1st of January, data that's included in the EU Data Boundary promise, which is almost all data. We can go into details there if you want. Is processed and stored in the EU, and it's going to be continuously focused on that. So also support data and diagnostic data will over time this year stay in the EU. We also have some projects called full sovereign clouds, which we are doing in France and in Germany. So that basically means that a partner to Microsoft, normally a telecom provider and a big consultancy company, go together, they form a company and they build a data center and license the Microsoft Cloud Platform. So that's normally focused on national security legislations. In France, they have something called Secnum Cloud, which is a legislation that basically forces this kind of security architecture. Sometimes you have encryption that's interesting from a legal perspective. So encryption can protect from a lot of things, but if you want to protect data from the provider of the cloud service, it's not all encryptions that works like that, but end-to-end encryption obviously works like that. So if, for instance, in team calls, you now have end-to-end encryption. So that means that Microsoft cannot access the data between two Teams client if you add that capability. It's not added by default. But you can use it. It will affect, because it protects data from Microsoft, it will affect Schrems and also Swedish secrecy concerns, which is part of the OSL legislation in Sweden. If you want to use it in Microsoft 365 for storage, like data or other parts, SharePoint, you can use double key encryption, which also have the kind of same effect. It's not the end-to-end encryption, but it encrypts data twice. Basically, Microsoft encrypts it and the customer encrypts it. So that's also important encryption capability when it comes to legal effects. And then you have confidential compute, and that's something that's not very common today. I expect it will be more common for a couple of reasons. It has a legal effect because it also shields data in the cloud from Microsoft. It creates a bubble that Microsoft cannot penetrate. Using kind of traditional TPM chips and the next generation technology here in the chips. So Microsoft does not have access to data, and it doesn't work on all Azure services, but we are seeing it's growing into becoming a much more mature platform, which means it's probably going to be interesting for a lot of new capabilities for very sensitive data. And then I think you also see a lot of positive news when it comes to legal changes as well. So you see that we have the new transatlantic data privacy framework that's being right now processed in the EU. And it's expected to be in place, a so-called advocacy decision is expected to be in place before the summer. And that means it should solve the third party or the data transfers that was pointed out by Schrems. And we're also seeing positive things happening in the OSL, Swedish Confidentiality Act. For instance, if you have health data, there is a new proposal for legislation that means, yes, you can actually, you're allowed from a legal perspective to actually process that data at an outsourcing provider or a cloud provider. So we're seeing some ice breaking here as well. So I think this is you can address these legal concerns both with technology and obviously with legal changes as well. And the third topic is digital sovereignty. So what is digital sovereignty then? I don't think there is a very good, super crisp explanation of what that means. And we're also seeing that it means different things for different countries. But if you think about it, I think what it really means is that you need more control. So there is a need for having more control. And what does control mean? Well, control could mean legal control. You want stronger control from a legal perspective on your data. It could mean technical control, hardware control, network control. You want to be control of data transfers, etc. Or just data control. It could be a lot of other things that you also want to have control over, or at least more control, because you can never be in full control or have full sovereignty. So it has to be a balance there. What we are seeing is that the way you think about digital sovereignty is very different. So if you go to the Baltic countries, for instance, they have an interest of, if you want to have sovereignty, you always have to store the data outside the country as well, to protect the sovereignty of the data if there is an invasion, basically, from Russia. So there is different perspectives on sovereignty. So that means you have to have a capability of creating different sovereign clouds for different countries. And that's basically what Microsoft Cloud for Sovereignty is about. So that was introduced this summer when everybody was on vacation, so nobody have heard about this. But there was announced a new initiative called Microsoft Cloud Sovereign. And what is that really? Well, it is not super simple to explain so extremely crisp, because it is a public cloud, but it's a public cloud with some new capabilities and a lot of packaged capabilities that's addressing or helping with sovereignty. And the idea here is to create a sovereign cloud that's targeted at a specific country, that fits that specific digital sovereignty needs in that country. So one of the capabilities is, of course, data residency. If you have, for instance, a need to have data stored externally, or being able to quickly move it in an architecture, you have the possibility of doing that. You also have the possibility of storing it in a specific region. And in Sweden, we have the ability to store it in Sweden. It's not every country that has that ability, but we have that because we have backup as well here in Sweden. And then there are a lot of other sovereign controls that's going to be included in Microsoft Cloud Sovereign. What is that? It's something called the Azure Sovereign Landing Zone, which is a specific landing zone that's going to help with quality control, basically policies on applications that you deploy in the Azure Cloud Sovereign. So you cannot deploy something that goes against the policies of what that country have decided should be important, for instance. And you also have new capabilities there, like governance and transparency. What's included there? Well, we're going to talk more about that during the next couple of months. But it could be more audit rights, it could be more transparency into our data centers work, etc. And one other part that's going to be important here is confidential compute. Because confidential compute is going to be integrated into Microsoft Cloud Sovereign, which also means it's going to protect data in a much higher extent from Microsoft. It's focused on Azure. I forgot to mention that. And who is going to decide then how the policies works in Sweden? What is a digital cloud or digital sovereignty in Sweden? Well, it's not necessarily Microsoft that's going to decide that, because that's not necessarily our expertise or our mandate to do. So we are working with partners, we are working with customers that's looking into those capabilities and saying, this is what we would like to have. This is these controls that we would like to have to feel that we have a stronger sovereign cloud. So I think that was basically, I think that was the last slide. And we wanted to open up a little bit for questions and things and thoughts on this topic. It's quite a big topic, to be honest, but we're open for questions. Oh. Okay, should we? Okay, let's start there. Okay.
Well, you're probably absolutely right, and that was because we were in a phase where we had a build-out session, and now we're actually, when I looked at it last, all my screens are green, which means that I'm now loading the region with sufficient capacity for also those kind of free versions. We have been focusing on paying customers, and that's the way that we've been prioritizing. But they should be open now, and if they're not, please do give me a ping, and I'll see what we can do. I I understand. I fully understand. We should be open now.
Yeah. Yep. So the question is the data boundary, is it free and is it, is it default? Yes and yes. So it is free. So it's free for everybody that's using. So it comes with the architecture that we have been doing. And I would say uh, almost everything is default for EU data boundary. If you use the core services, if you have a more complex, if you're, for instance, if you're buying something that multi-region, these kind of areas, then you are maybe not involved. But for the absolute majority, you don't have to do anything really. It's just included. Some more? Yeah, it's so the question is for the kind of high confidentiality data. That's a little bit more complex because in normal, if you have säkerhetsskyddslagen, it also means that the personnel that's accessing that data needs to have a security clearance from SAP or somebody else, and that's actually not what we can do in our data centers. However, we are looking into how can you maybe utilize things like confidential compute to isolate data from having that need. And there's also a lot of ongoing things happening on säkerhetsskyddslagen as well. There's a new kind of säkerhetsskydds agreement as well that's trying to push data from the highest confidentiality to a slightly lower confidentiality, but doesn't have the need for security clearance on personnel. So there's a lot of things happening there, but if you have the top secret data, that's going to be challenging from that perspective at this point in time. Oh, a new question. Yeah. Mm. 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 Yeah. So I think the big change that will happen is the new transatlantic data privacy agreement. So there has been, as you say, from a lot of public sector customers, they are concerned about how does this really, you haven't really seen any data protection agency going and saying this is yes or no. So it's still kind of a floating topic where people don't feel that they have the mandate to themselves say yes and no, and then they say better to say no. But the new transatlantic deal will mean it will address the third country transfers that has been the problem. So if that passes, the legal environment is going to change. And I think if that passes before the summer, it's going to take some time to process. So maybe after the summer, these organizations that think, okay, this is time to reevaluate, basically. Okay. Any other pressing? Okay.
With the availability of quantum computing, is Microsoft doing already anything on the encryption front? Oh, can I answer?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. We're doing some really cool stuff. I don't know if you know about the NATIC project. Basically, what we did was we took a big tube, we put a data center in it, and we dumped it outside of the coastline of Scotland. And one of the projects that we were doing there was actually QPC implementation, so post-quantum cryptography. And we were testing out the algorithms that is needed for us to be able to utilize that type of cryptography also for broad bandwidth data transfers. So yes, we're absolutely working on the on post-quantum cryptography capabilities. And
So-
if you want, you can look that up. And there is a bit of a research team, and they have a paper post-quantum cryptography. NATIC. Yes.
There was, I don't know if you saw, but so the challenge with quantum computing is, of course, there is this Peter Shor algorithm that says, well, if you have enough qubits, you're going to break RSA encryption. So people is still saying, well, that's 5-10 years. It takes that time. So, but a couple of weeks ago, you had a new paper from a Chinese research team that basically said, well, we found a new algorithm that doesn't need this 1000 qubits. It just takes 400 qubits or so, which is actually something that's possible today. So suddenly you had a situation where, oh, maybe it's already cracked. So that, turned a lot of discussions in that industry. It seems like it's not, though. So it's false alarm.
I've seen Microsoft is one of the contributors to some of those algorithms that are currently in evaluation to choose the common new algorithm that will be able to handle post-quantum computing.
Yes.
I've seen at least one of those proposals that
Yes.
are running around.
Yes, we are. Yeah, that's true. So one of the proposals on the next generation is coming from Microsoft.
So we're absolutely active in this space.
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you for listening.